king doth keep his revels here tonight. Take heed, the queen come not within his sight, for Oberon is passing fell and wrath, because that she, as her attendant, hath a lovely boy stolen from an Indian king. She never had so sweet a changeling, and jealous Oberon would have the child, knight of his train, to trace the forests wild. But she, perforce, withholds the loved boy, crowns him with flowers, and makes him all her joy. Room, fairy, here comes Oberon.
Ill met by moonlight, proud Titania.
What, jealous Oberon? Fairies, skip hence. I have forsworn his bed and company.
Tarry, rash wanton, am not I thy lord?
Then I must be thy lady, but I know, when thou wast stolen away from fairyland and in the shape of Corin sat all day, playing on pipes of corn and versing love to amorous Phillida. Why art thou here? But that forsooth the bouncing Amazon, your buskined mistress, and your warrior love, to Theseus must be wedded. And you come to give their bed joy and prosperity.
How canst thou, for shame, Titania, glance at my credit with Hippolyta, knowing I know thy love to Theseus?
These are the forgeries of jealousy, and never since the middle summer spring met we on hill, in dale, forest, or in mead, by paved fountain, or by rushy brook, or in the beached margent of the sea, to dance our ringlets to the whistling wind, but with thy brawls thou hast disturbed our sport. Therefore the winds, piping to us in vain as in revenge, have sucked up from the sea contagious fogs, which, falling in the land, hath every pretty river made so proud that they have overborne their continents. The human mortals want their winter here. No night is now with him or carol blessed. Therefore the moon, the governess of floods, pale in her anger, washes all the air, that rheumatic diseases do abound. And through this distemperature we see the seasons alter. Hoarded-headed frosts fall in the fresh lap of the crimson rose, and on old Heim's chin an icy crown, an odorous chaplet of sweet summer buds is as in mockery set. The spring, the summer, the childling autumn, angry winter change their wanton liveries, and the mazed world by their increase now knows not which is which. And this same progeny of evils comes from our debate, from our dissension. We are their parents and original.
Do you amend it then? It lies in you. Why should Titania cross her Oberon? I do but beg a little changeling boy to be my henchman.
Set your heart at rest. The fairyland buys not the child of me. His mother was a votress of my order. Full often hath she gossiped by my side, and sat with me on Neptune's yellow sands, marking the embarked traders on the flood, when we have laughed to see the sails conceive and grow big-bellied with the wanton wind, which she with pretty and with swimming gait following, her womb then rich with my young squire, would imitate, and sail upon the land to fetch me trifles and return again. But she being mortal of that boy did die, and for her sake I do rear up her boy, and for her sake I will not part with him.
How long within this wood intend you stay?
Perhaps till after Theseus' wedding day. If you will patiently dance in our round and see our moonlight revels, go with us. If not, shun me, and I will spare your haunts.
And I shall go with thee.
Not for thy fairy kingdom. Fairies away, we shall chide down right if I longer stay.
Well, go thy way. Thou shalt not from this grove till I
Hello,
torment
listeners.
thee
You're
for
tuning
this
in to the
injury.
Bardcast Weekly with Will Kemp's Players. You just heard Shae Fitzgerald as Puck, Michael Lake as Oberon, and Victoria Benkoski as Titania, performing excerpts from A Midsummer Night's Dream, Act 2, Scene 1.
Your hosts, as always, are myself, Rob Johnson, Phil Beattie,
Hello.
and Shae Fitzgerald.
Hey.
Michael Lake is also with us today in conversation.
Hey, everybody.
And our spotlight artist this week is Rags.
Hi there.
Since this is our very first episode, here's what to expect. Each week we'll be offering some excerpts of Shakespeare scenes, followed by a lively discussion with some of our players on dramatic themes, relevance of work, and how we take this stuff to performance as an original practices worker-owned cooperative.
Rags, let's go ahead and start with you. Tell us a bit about your artistic career. How did you come to Shakespeare performance and the original practices technique?
Well, how does anybody else get to Shakespeare? You begin by getting fed some crap in middle school or high school, usually through a really poorly edited translation. And then if you're lucky, like myself, you wind up at Schenectady County Community College with a woman named Sandra Boynton, who basically says, one day you're going to wake up and everything you know will be wrong. And sure enough, I wound up doing my first performance with her with All's Well That Ends Well back in 2008 or 9, I want to say, in terms of Shakespeare. And that's when she introduced me to the original practices style of rehearsing and producing works of Shakespeare. And it's been kind of going that way for the last 12 years.
Can you speak to exactly what that means as far as what the original practices style of rehearsal is?
So, from what I understand, there is no exactly, but what we are trying to do is emulate the way Shakespeare may have rehearsed and performed these works. We often like to say Shakespeare in a way that Shakespeare himself might have recognized. That means that the onus is on the text. The translations are from the 1623 folio, which is extremely important in that it has the original spelling and punctuation. So you really get a sense of the poetry, of the cadence, all of the original words, so nothing has kind of been dumbed down or contemporized. That also means that your actors are rehearsing from cue scripts, which are the previous 5 syllables to your line itself, and that repeats over and over throughout the entire text of the play. The other important thing as the musical director of the company is that we keep all of the music, which you can find in the folio as italics. So that means that the text that Shakespeare has set to music is indicated, and I actually go back and try to adapt melodies from people like John Dowland or any of the other composers that would have been alive at that time, and use their melodies to inform the way that I write that music. I think with original practices, you also have to realize that there was a lot of improvisation in Shakespeare, as well as there was a lot of audience interaction. When I say improvisation, I don't mean like making up the text, although we certainly do think that Will Kemp did a fair amount of that in his career.
Sure.
And if you've ever seen Upstart Crow, well, he definitely does.
Yes.
But that relationship between audience and actor as character, the non-existence of a fourth wall, those are also elements. We use Elizabethan dress, we use real swords, and often we keep our plays in the time period of Elizabethan England in the 16th century.
So I actually have a question tying all of this back to our focus topic of this week, which is Midsummer Night's Dream, in particular our production of it that happened last summer. So you directed that project.
I did.
And you're also the musical director of the company. Could you speak a little bit to how those two elements tied together for you artistically and sort of what you were able to create as a result?
Great question, Shae. Approaching my first and, so far only directorial debut within the company, as having been the musical director, means that I often look at works of Shakespeare as a score, as a composer might, an orchestral composer.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the pieces and parts are sequenced and layered and have all these nuance of instruments and harmony. And when I think about that, the first thing that comes to mind for me is overtones, the notion that when one or more voices is playing, depending on the room, depending on the instrument used, depending on, the climate, you will actually achieve a slightly different set of overtones, which actually greatly affects the harmonics and the perception of the piece. And when you apply that or extrapolate it to the text itself as a theatrical experience, as opposed to a solely musical one, you're looking for those relationships between the characters and their environment to bring out other relevant themes, if you want to think about that. The overtones of the audience's contemporary awareness of the world around them in their time, and how that contrasts or complements maybe Shakespeare's understanding, or what we research to be Shakespeare's understanding of his time, and where the play is set. So those three elements are kind of creating harmony like a chord. For me, magic and the notion of dreaming are very prominent in my personal life. And I think they play a large part in my artistic life as well. So to consider them in terms of direction, that means that I wanted to bring things in that actually created real magic. So we brought in the element of the runes, for instance, and we brought in the notion of physicality that was non-human or extra-human. And what that allowed us to do is really demonstrate the two various worlds that exist within that play, the world of the mechanicals and of the Greeks. So essentially you have the human world, and then you have the fairy world with Oberon, Titania, and all of the fairies, and where those intersectionalities are between them.
Yeah, I really love that kind of overarching idea, especially the idea of overtones as an analytical point of how this kind of text works, because with verse, you have the iambic pentameter right there, and it's very rhythmic, and so it's honestly, it's very similar if you look at it philosophically to the way music is scored. And obviously you understand that. And I think it's really interesting for people. I'm not anywhere near as experienced a musician as you, but I definitely still appreciate it as well.
You're a fine musician.
Oh my goodness. No, it's true. But for as little as I read sheet music, which is honestly how I should put that, I still have kind of that awareness of that sheet music is laid out, in specific rhythms with specific, almost like syllabic ties to one another. And there are demarcations in the writing of it where there are supposed to be pauses, yada, yada, yada. And it's like you can find all of those same elements in the way a good piece of iambic pentameter is written. There's so much like orchestration, literal like actual orchestration written into the text. And for me, I think that is one of the most important parts of why original practices works, I think, is because if you're looking at those elements of the text, it really can come to life in a way that I don't even know, I sometimes can't even put it into words,
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. Something you just caused me to think about is the way in which like a long form classical piece will have call and response between different instruments, right? Or various instruments will pick up a motif. So the flute might pick up the violin motif, and then you might find the bass rhythm of that actually echoed in the timpani or in the contrabass. And it is very similar in the way that the characters and their different texts work. Certain characters obviously have certain rhythmic motifs that get picked up and played with. And we saw that a lot in Othello, for sure, between Iago and Othello. I think you see this a lot between Oberon and Puck.
Well, I have two things to go off that. One, it's almost, again, comparing this for more modern audiences, there's a lot of Sondheim-esque to this, where...
Yeah.
Oh, of course you would say that. Yeah.
The way that he writes is very... I look at, like a Little Night Music, where like the original concept for that was that he wanted every character to play an instrument that represented, their character, their soul, what they were going through throughout the piece. He didn't end up doing that, but a lot of this is very similar to that in that respect. You created something that, without all the music, still weaving some sort of score together.
Yeah, absolutely.
And secondly, I think we should also talk a little bit about your decision to introduce not just music, but also Foley for sound effects, which created more of this magic.
Yeah. I would love to put a pin in Foley and come back to it in just a moment. Mike, what was it that you would wanted to throw in?
The use of the language as a performer, as someone who has to recite and invoke these words, it's also metaphorically, related in this term of like this song, this rhythm. A lot of times, if I'm doing a contemporary piece, I'll try to set my lines to a beat in my head, and I'll memorize them that way.
Oh, yeah.
And working in this this time period, not even just Shakespeare, but in the time, the style of writing. Although Shakespeare seems to have been able to do it in a way that keeps him relevant, that's another way to look at it too, in terms of rhythm, and how the rhythm also informs your movement and everything about the piece.
Yeah, exactly. Rags brought up a really great point about working with the physical body in regards to performing this idea of magic, this sense, this sense of conjuring. And I think that's a really cool element to Midsummer itself as well, is that the script, the text, really lends itself towards this idea of conjuring, of casting spells, of bringing things forward to the forefront. Even in shows that don't involve magic, it's still there and it's still resonant because, in one way, shape, or form, we are conjuring forth emotions that the audience is having. And so I think that kind of takes it to the next level with Midsummer, because we are actively performing spells, casting enchantments, and using the structural framework of the script to allow that magic to be brought forth.
Most definitely. I mean, that is so original practices in that sense, about actually allowing the words to inform your performance of them, and that their composition is very telling about what your character is becoming. You've all reminded me of a couple things. If you think about Peter and the Wolf, for instance, as a piece of music,
yeah,
right? Like literally the instrument's job in that piece is to become the voices of those characters. And so when you have animal characters, I mean, each instrument actually represents a specific character. So like the duck is the clarinet, the grandfather is a bassoon, and you have, the violin. Oh
man, I used to listen to that so much as a kid. Seriously, that was like one of my earliest influences.
Oh man,
it's the Carol. Wasn't it Carol Channing who recorded that at one point?
Yes,
okay,
yes.
I'm not crazy.
That's such a good
crazy.
Version.
Yeah, I know, it's great. That was like, we had that on CD when I was a kid, and like I remember being like 4 and thinking that it was really weird, but also being really into it.
Oh yeah.
There's like that weird dissonance of like, this is an odd story, but also finding it really like intriguing.
Yeah, it kind of, I mean, it really lets you see beyond the veil, as it were. It takes the mask off of what music is supposed to be. In the classical idiom, it's like, this is a cerebral experience, so close your eyes and like bring yourself there and imagine these lines becoming the images before your eyes. And with a piece like that, I mean, it really does it for you. So if you extrapolate that to Midsummer on stage, I mean, you actually have those people, like now they're not just doing it sonically, but they're embodying it physically and with their voices. And not to mention, I mean, everyone, of course, their voices sit at different levels. You have basses and baritones and tenors and sopranos and different qualities even within those ranges that are also indicative. I mean, that's all part of casting. I think something that a director needs to look at, that I certainly did with Midsummer, was that when I was watching people audition and then kind of running them through the paces of the sides, it wasn't simply just like the look or the physicality or the voice, but it's actually, the amalgamation of those things. It's where they all come together. And like, can you tell the story by fully embodying the story in your live performance of it, in like your body and your experience?
Exactly.
And
I mean, in your whole instrument, essentially.
Yeah, and then of course
the instrument that is your personhood.
Yes, we are instruments. Actors are instruments with a dynamic range of
absolutely
of expressions and possibilities.
Yeah, I heard that constantly in the conservatory that I studied at, Stella Adler Studio. So that's something that's just like always in my. And it's funny. Speaking of conservatory, I'm the one person in this group right now who was not trained by Sandy. So I think that's kind of funny, because even though I wasn't, there is a fundamental similarity to the awesome Shakespeare training that I got at Adler and the way that Sandy works. So the reason that I think found so much interest with the original practices thing was that it was stemming from something that I had already encountered. And Rags, the point that you made about the idea of like with Peter and the Wolf and kind of removing the veil rather than ushering someone through the process of what is happening, actually doing the thing. And if living in it and allowing that to convey. Because one of the most important, like I got a very text-based Shakespeare education as well, and one of the most important fundamentals that was drilled into us from the immediate onset of class was you are acting on the line. There is no air unless the script offers offers a space for air because the verse is, offset or what have you. And so there is no room to stop and think and act through silence.
Right.
It's all constructed in a way.
Yeah.
It's all constructed in a way
Exactly.
to make that all those decisions unnecessary. The first thing to do when you're handed a script, and the first thing we do when we sit down at table read, is you just have the physical book in your hand and you're looking at the words and you're looking at the punctuation. And when you hit the snags and you hit the spaces that sound funny or don't sound right, it's because there's something that was happening that you were either unaware of or ignoring that you get to now go back and look at. And I think part of the reason why the modern actor struggles with Shakespeare is because we are no longer trained to rely on a text. We're trained to rely on a process. We're trained to rely on a process that we apply to a work that we are handed and asked to play a part, and we are given license to interpret that in a way that is based on a process, whereas Shakespeare gives you the text. You have to remember, they didn't work. One of the aspects that we in practice apply, but down on paper and for the purposes of actually doing the thing, we work with directors, but our rehearsal room is a very collaborative room. And
exactly.
Which is carrying the place of the directorless rehearsal room, which is what is believed to be the situation for most of Shakespeare's performances in his time. So basically, you're given a text, and the text is telling you what to do, and you get to interpret what the change is. You get to interpret what your want is. You know what I mean? You get to tell, but he tells you where it is. He tells you, and it's all by how the text originally appears.
It's a pedagogy of discovery rather than decisions that then get reenacted, right?
Oh,
you are
I
discovering
love
that in
that.
the text. And then, I mean, in a lot of ways, like, you're making me think about also the advent of film and just contemporary theater. Like, if we put the method in there, can we say in this podcast?
I mean, sure.
I think we can now.
I don't know. We'll find out.
We'll cut it out later.
But to say, what I'm thinking of right now, what's very real to me, is that within film and also within the method and other contemporary processes of acting, and where you want the audience to kind of zoom in on your face or zoom in on your body and like observe tension and observe that emotion like crossing you, because it's happening while the text is happening in Shakespeare, and given the context that like they didn't have that ability. Like, there was no ability to like blow up somebody's face and get like a nice long shot of their eyes like slowly moving or their face slowly changing. You had to put it all out there in the immediate. I mean, in a lot of ways, like if you put Shakespeare kind of in the center of if you think about Shakespeare as like a vortex or like a black hole, it's kind of like on one side of that universe, all of the information that you are gathering and processing through the text as an actor and through the creative process condenses into a singular point. Then you arrive on stage in a live performance setting, and your responsibility now is to explode that out to the audience so that they can receive all of that. But you have to be that moment. You have to be that inciting event. Essentially, it's like every actor on a Shakespearean stage is their own Big Bang. And something else that's important to, I think, piggyback on this is that within Shakespeare, there's always stories happening within and outside of the story while it's going along. We don't necessarily see that with writing for television or for movies or for the stage now. A lot of it's very plot driven, and Shakespeare certainly is plot driven, but there's all of these things that are happening. I mean, if you think about just the enumeration of subplots within any given Shakespeare play, because there's, like anywhere between 20 and like...
Look at
like
Midsummer. Midsummer's got literally like 3 main plots running at the same time. Like...
Yeah, like,
Right,
and think
and so-
about the audience at that time. Like, they're gonna pick, they're gonna pick who they're identifying with, and being in those spaces, it wasn't like being in the theater. So it's kind of like, now. So it's kind of like, they kind of got to do like, oh, hey, you're here for 2.5, 3, 4 hours. You pick characters you give a shit about, and then and you follow what they're this story if you don't care about the kings.
Oh yeah.
So, Rag, something that you said reminded me of one of my favorite expressions that my favorite Shakespeare teacher used to say, which I probably told you about before, but it's Shakespeare isn't elbow acting, it's armpit acting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, I love this armpit acting thing. Yeah,
like exactly, like this idea of like you have to extend, because if you're not extending fully into that narrative, into that real moment that you need to be living in, there is not authenticity there.
And that's important for a show like
simulacrum.
Midsummer too, right? When you're conveying these crazy, out of this
Yeah,
world
exactly.
characters,
Oh my gosh.
like you have to really do it, or else what are you doing?
Exactly. Well, because if you spend time like censoring yourself and almost commenting on yourself as a performer while you live as, say a hobgoblin, or as Oberon, the king of the fairies who can change into a tree, like those things, you're living them at 100% face value. And when you experience those things and move through them as a performer, that's what helps the audience to suspend their disbelief and live in that realm of fantasy and magic.
And it's important to note that at that time, the audience would have been believing in that. We think now in our modern age that these are stories, that these are fables, childhood images that, we give credence and importance to. But at that time, they believed these things were real. And I mean, I believe some of those things are still real.
Tell us about Elizabethan fairies. I want to know more about Elizabethan fairy lore as it relates to your interpretation of Midsummer.
Well, boy, how much time do we have? No. So in brief summation, what I can say that's very important is that in Elizabethan belief at the time, fairies were actually characters within everyday life. Fairies were otherworldly creatures that lived and walked among human beings, as well as had their own designated realms. An example being when you walked into the forest, whether it's, to get from here to there, or to pick wild mushrooms or other edible plants, or to frolic and play, or, maybe copulate a wedding ceremony. If you come across a fairy ring, which would have been a ring of mushrooms that would have surrounded a tree, typically like an oak or a willow, because of the mycelial networks that surrounded them, you would know, as someone in Elizabethan England, that if you walked into that fairy ring, you may very well be transported into an entirely other realm where time works differently, age works differently, size works differently,
That's because they
and
ate
you can
the
become
mushrooms.
I wonder about that myself.
Oh man.
Midsummer brought to you by psilocybin.
Good old Silo.
It's not inaccurate.
I know,
Well,
it's...
literally. We use plants to put spells on people, and then they hallucinate things that they don't see. Like,
Yeah, it's real. I mean, it's really funny. I'm sitting here in my music studio, and I'm looking at a poster of Alice in Wonderland that says "Feed your head" with the caterpillar sitting on the giant mushroom.
Yes.
So I mean,
Amazing.
yeah, I get it. But it wasn't just the realm of the forest. We certainly have that, and kind of that lore was actually practical knowledge for use in the everyday life of an Elizabethan person. It's also that they came into your space. They came into your home. I mean, Puck and some of the other fairies would have been considered, hobgoblins or brownies, is another common Elizabethan term for fairies. Yeah. Well, no, they weren't Ethiop fairies. You know what I mean? Like Shakespeare definitely had his racial indicators throughout his text, but I don't think brownie was one of them.
It's a little bit too modern.
But see,
nor was it a culinary aspect.
Yes.
which also could be magical. They would have existed within the space of humans, right? So there was this mythology around leaving your door or window open, right? And some people believed that if you were good to these fairies, like maybe you put out a bowl of milk, or you left an empty shoe, or, you know, you had left them some other kind of tribute, that they would come in and like organize your house for you, for instance, or become helpful in the kitchen. Now, of course, if you angered them as well, you would be looking at all kinds of mischief, right? If we think about the scene, I think it's 2-1, where Puck meets an opposing fairy, right, from Titania's court. You have this discussion of pulling the leg out of the three-legged stool and making the woman like spit up her bobbed apples, and like all of these other images of fairies causing mischief. Now, from an anthropological point of view, it's probably, you know, what's happening is fairy lore is being used to explain things that people cannot explain. I dropped this thing and it disappeared, or that chair was totally fine, why did it break? Or, you know, my hat has gone missing.
Motto of our 2019 season, that chair was totally fine, why did it break?
Absolutely.
Oh, man. I was talking about this the other night. Do you remember when I literally fell off the 3-foot stool during Hamlet? It just kicked itself out from under me. And I was like, I've been playing Puck for too long. This is dangerous.
It was amazing.
Put you in your place.
You brought some of that energy into the...
I usually say I pucked myself.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Give a puck.
Well, yep. I mean, I think it kind of happened to all of us in that show, because I was also talking about when we were doing Act 5, and I sat down on one of those jankety stools that wasn't glued together, and it just like broke when I went to sit back down. But you know, I kept it within Peter Quince's little realm.
Yeah,
something's happened
Phil,
here.
I would love to hear.
I just stood the rest of the scene.
I would love to hear how you, as a performer, worked with all of this mythological ideology while performing and living in a completely different realm than like all of that, you know, because like I know mine and Mike's experience of like, you know, working as buddy fairies for a summer.
We were pretty much attached to the hip of the entire show, so we know exactly how each other feel about it. Quite literally attached at the hip sometimes.
Thanks, Tree Dad. But yeah, Phil, I would really love to hear about kind of your perspective playing a mortal in a world filled with magic, and kind of how that went for you.
Playing the essential Shakespeare character of the show. The writer.
The beleaguered writer.
The eager writer. It was quite interesting, actually, just because there's a lot to convey when you come into a show like Midsummer, where there is like a lot of magic, and you have to really create these distinctions between who is magical, who is not magical, what can they see, what can't they see. I mean, coming from a comedic background like I do, I enjoy working in scenes where I have to create a lot of things that aren't there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's gotta be fun.
As Christoph mentioned earlier, there is some notions of improv not necessarily detrimental to the production.
Take that, Dustin Hoffman.
But there are definitely some needs to create reactions that justify to the audience that, well, this person clearly knows that something happened, but they can't see what happened. They're not totally sure what it is. Unless, you know, we get into talking about Act 3, where the whole bottom becomes an ass thing comes into play. Because then Peter Quince and, I mean, I would say all of the mechanicals at that point sort of just realize, well, magic is real, and we're all just going to go home now. And we're just going to think about what just happened to us in our lives.
Reckon with that now.
we got to reckon with what has just happened.
Yeah, because what was really fun for me working with you guys was getting to create that really quick scene where there's, you know, Puck kind of comes in invisibly, and there's that absolute flurry of like just completely messing with you guys. for that,
Chaos.
but like
Chaos.
exactly.
Organized
but
chaos.
The amount of time that we spent like really, really specifically orchestrating that was really fun for me, because that amount of specificity allows you to, again, do what we talked about and live in the moment and experience those things as if they're really happening, as if a puck that you can't see has thrown up an invisible wall in front of you and you're knocked on your back, or you've been turned into, what was it that I did to David? I turned him into a bear and a lion, all the different stuff that it was so much fun to work from a perspective of one of us being a magical being and enacting those things, and therefore living in delivering the idea of casting those spells, and then also have a stage full of mortal humans reacting and living in the circumstances that they could see.
The beauty of that too is really now, so you're explaining these things that we ultimately decided to do with your characters' interactions with other characters, but the beauty of what the text is able to provide, kind of going back to that, is that these are all things that are in every show that he writes, because these are plot driving conceits that he uses. It's the same as darkness on stage when we're obviously all in a lit room, because another aspect of Shakespeare's time was that they didn't have lighting, and so none of the shows require it as a function of driving the plot, because everyone on stage is responsible for selling the text. So just like Phil is responsible for communicating that he is aware of strange happenings without the happening's origin or how it's happening, it's the same for in the tragedies where people can't see each other as they fight in the dark, or what is a believable distance between people where two people on stage can have a conversation that two other people on stage don't hear. And that's all built in from the text, and you don't get to not do it because you're there and you have to do it. You can put as much distance as you want between you and them, but you have to do it.
It's a matter of getting from point A to point B with using the text.
Right, and selling why when you're holding your torch in one part of the stage, you can see but they can't.
Right, and the text gives you that.
Look at Lear. There's a storm on stage. And you can't put a storm there unless the actor is performing being in a storm.
Well, arguably, they could have done some water stuff in the globe.
Yeah.
Because it was just,
but,
it was a hay
in
floor.
The context of,
they could have had water outside.
But, also in the context of, taking these shows out on the road as well. That's stuff that they couldn't bring with them. You know what I mean?
Is a really, really adventurous duke or something? He was like...
Yeah, exactly.
Like a wading pool.
Let me throw a bunch of cash at you.
I'm
your fiscal sponsor for the season.
Well, the big difference is that belief is in action with this kind of acting, as opposed to belief being made possible by effect, right?
Oh, damn, Rags, that's so beautiful and deep.
This is why I'm your special guest.
I know, exactly. You're the best person to kind of kick us off here.
Ah, shucks.
So, with all of this magic and all of the practicalities required of the actors to play physically, usually that's a director's blocking and a director's touch in setting the stage, but a lot of that is already handled by the script and by the rhythm, which fundamentally changes a lot of how a director relates to a play. How was this production of Midsummer Night's Eve different for you than a standard directed piece?
Sure. This is a great question. It means that I am someone, as a crafts person, theatrically speaking, who is working to bring out the elements that really speak to me and the theme of the play and the theme that the actors are all collaborating on, rather than crafting them according to some kind of arbitrary vision, right? Or to some specific directions. Like specific directions, like think Beckett, where every little moment is so prescribed that you really can't escape it as a director. And it's really more about how you kind of force the actor into that mold in a way that's meaningful for both the actor and the play. Whereas with Shakespeare, it's kind of like being someone who is, and I think, Mike, like you might appreciate this as a carpenter, when you're working with natural wood, the way that you sand it, the contour that you give to the grain, the certain kind of stain you use, or the joinery work actually brings out the qualities of that wood. So in a lot of ways, you're enhancing the material that's already there, and then using it to say what you want to say and what the text is already saying at the same time, as opposed to prescribing like specific blocking or movements that are supposed to be, I don't know, subtextual or according to the actor's creative vision. It's like the way in which we deal with Shakespeare is this is not a vehicle for a director's specific artistic commentary. That's part of it, but it has to exist in the realm with the text and with what the text is saying itself. Because otherwise, I feel like you can see right through it. It becomes totally disingenuous. And I think the audience can see through that as well, which may be responsible for why, in my personal opinion, so many contemporary performances of Shakespeare appear boring and banal. Even though they're like fantastic and set with like elaborate costumes and in different time periods and incredible set and effects. It's like, but the Shakespeare isn't there. The theater of it isn't there. And so it's lacking.
Exactly. Well, what's funny is the reverse of that, almost. And this is something that ties into something that Mike said earlier when he was talking about learning contemporary scripts and, working with the actual rhythm of the language, finding those rhythms in the same way. I feel personally like working in original practices and learning, being trained as a good Shakespearean actor, that is inherently going to inform the rest of your career as an artist working on contemporary realistic performance, because looking at a show as a thing and a script and a script that already has qualities inherent to it that you as the artists are working to bring out together, personally I feel that is really what makes good theater across the board. It doesn't matter whether it's contemporary, it doesn't matter whether it's Shakespearean. When you use the script as an equal tool and remember that it's there for a reason and that there are all kinds of different contextual values that apply to it, all of the same work that we do with Shakespeare plays can 100% be done to a contemporary show. It's going to look a little different in practice and it's going to, come off a little different in performance, but I personally don't really feel a lot of difference for myself in a Shakespeare rehearsal room versus a contemporary rehearsal room.
Agreed. Whether you're actor or director, once you've gone through this process or any similar process, you can't look at a script the same way. You can't look at it as like, I think this is the difference between an object to art, as you might say, like this is a standalone thing that says its piece. And theater certainly can't be this at all, right? It's a living and breathing organism that has to be interpreted in its entirety. It has to be embodied.
Because trying to say a piece can only go so far. Because your audience, you cannot possibly control or command what your audience is going to interpret or take away from your performance.
No, and we have to remember too that in Elizabethan England, and I think what Will Kemp's brings to audiences now is that we encourage them to respond to that in real time, and that response informs what happens on stage next. Right?
Yes.
Like, so if
because we have that element of interaction.
Yes. And now it's a dialogue. And I think that's what a lot of artists, and I cannot speak for all artists, certainly not. But I can say that I think many artists are working to have that dialogue with whatever their medium is. I think about oil paintings right now and how, you listen to or read an artist commentary in their oil painting. It's like, well, it's never finished. It's still alive. And, because the paint kind of takes forever to dry, but also because the lighting changes, or as time changes around that painting, the context changes.
Yes.
And yet some people will look at like a work of Van Gogh and be like, okay, these are the symbols, this is the stroke, this is what it means, and so now I can deliver you this print and tell you what it means. And that's like kind of the difference between like good art school and bad art school. It's kind of the difference between method and original practices.
Absolutely.
And I'm maybe making some enemies right now saying that on this podcast.
No,
but
it's fine.
frankly, I don't give a damn.
No. No, you're not.
No enemies here.
No, not with you guys.
No enemies here. I mean,
technically speaking, anything Stanislavski derived is method, and some of it leans more towards styles that are similar to original practices, and some of it veers in a very different direction. But I think what everyone acknowledges and accepts as method is, more of what Rags was kind of pointing out.
right. And I mean, I'll put a little button on this so we can move on to the next question, though. But like, we as WKP do things original practices, but we do have, we'll discuss this more when we have Shane on our podcast. We do have a production coming up next season that will be in a different time period, but using the original practices method. So it's not to say that it can't be done. It just, there is more work to create the original practices notions in a different time period. But it doesn't make it any less or more original practices. We as a company are not trying to say that everything sucks. Just for our listeners. Just for our listeners.
There are certain members of this company that would argue that unless it was a site-specific show, I mean, even when they did Julius Caesar, they did it in doublets and hose. Like, they didn't do it in togas and sandals. So like they did it in the clothes that they had access to. I am very attracted to what a lot of people that both do original practices and people that don't do it, what they will do is they'll take Shakespeare and put it in a specific place that maybe speaks to the themes of the show, that maybe kind of just gives it an aesthetic look that you really enjoy. For instance, Midsummer, those of our listeners that were lucky enough to see it, because I think this podcast might have a wider reach than our tour does.
Maybe.
We had
maybe.
all of the Greeks in like what you would think of as traditional Grecian clothing, and then we had our rude mechanicals dressed as Elizabethan laborers. So
personally, as one of the people who put effort into the wardrobe of that show, I loved that.
Right.
I mean, it was very much a choice of like, this is what we have,
right.
But it wound up being one of my favorite aspects of the production. This
and even
kind
as
of
as a
nonchalance
designer to
towards
know
like
that
they're in Greece, and then these other people, because to me it's like the mechanicals are a very specific take of an Elizabethan player troupe. Like, that is what they are depicting. So allowing them to exist as an Elizabethan player troupe doesn't do a disservice if you
in Greece.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, but it's still fucking Greece.
But we're also talking about Theseus and Hippolyta, like these characters in themselves were myths.
There's gods also in this that are discussed.
None of this is real.
The fairies were their own set of clothes too.
Right, there's blue collar, there's aristocracy, there's otherworldly. All of those things directly translate to tropes that we see now. I mean, you could totally put Grecians in suits, have all of your mechanicals in overalls and wife beaters, and have your fairies in like body paint, and it would mean the same thing. What's that? It did almost happen. If I had only had my way.
I mean, Mike, you and I were definitely by the end of the run, you and I were definitely like Sharpieing tattoos on each other because the body pens had just ceased to work.
Just outdoor theater, y'all. It's struggles,
God.
sweat struggles.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the Sharpies though, because Shae, that is another directorial aspect of this play. is the divination aspect.
Yeah.
I mean, I can tell you, I read runes and tarot cards like every day throughout this process, and that kind of like helped inform me personally. But the fact that you all, well, many of you who played fairies, found like a bind rune, and for those of you listeners who don't know, runes are a form of Nordic divination based off an ancient language that they would have used for swords, for staves, for tombs, and for communicating other messages, but also for making decisions about their relationship to the gods and like whether they should like sack a city or retreat, among other things. And the fact that like the characters embodied their runes and like found a rune that was their expression as an artistic device, that actually consolidates all of the aspects of a single character into a symbol, a usable symbol that can kind of be used to call that back. And so that kind of brings me to the admission that like some of this is devising work. I mean, for those of you that understand devised theater, it's like that element is there as well, in that actors kind of get to make their own decisions, and some of the process is organic, where, you know, physical content, movement content, sound content, specifically with Foley to kind of start to arc this back.
Yeah, good call.
Was informed by the actors' choices, right? So there's some music, for instance, that prescribes movement and character and tone within the play, and then vice versa, actors' choices actually inform the music and sound effects that are being created.
We should mention our Foley artists, Mike Segura and Mike McDermott. Yeah, they really held us down. There were some others. There were some others that were at that Foley table.
Devin was in there.
I loved
was in
McDee's
there.
experience with like becoming a seasoned Foley artist.
It was great. You could tell he was having a really good time too.
And he because he loved it so much, and like I just love that he is the kind of artist who just performs in whatever way he's asked to do in the moment.
Absolutely.
And like, you know, whatever medium is required or requested of him, because it was like he was doing that, and then at the same time his dad role was just like hilarious. You know, I just have
he was playing both of them, which was really interesting too.
Yeah.
Not only for audience members but actors in the show to see the father character playing the Foley. It almost made it as if he was orchestrating this whole dream, which is kind of funny.
It's this
in
like
a way,
kind of
because he didn't want things to turn out the way they did, but maybe he did. I don't know.
Well, he's like the messenger, right? He was bringing Theseus not good messages, but. But
he was updating him on the news.
Well, I love the idea of McD playing the father, who's also the Foley artist. There's so much embodied in that, and the fact that the audience can see that, right? That the Foley's not coming from like a speaker or from a far off place. It's that there's several things. So one, as a dad, like, you know, he tries to exhibit so much of his will to get what he wants in this play. Like, that's his character's motive in a lot of ways. And then there he is, like, orchestrating the sound and the effects. So there is this, like, fatherly aspect to that. But also, he played him as sort of a belligerent and kind of, like, off-kilter character as well. And so to be at the Foley table is kind of like, all right, Dad's going to the man cave, getting wasted and playing his instruments, and y'all gotta listen to this shit. And then it turns out that it's like really beautiful music, and it's like perfectly synced up.
That's such a great image. Oh man,
it's great.
Oh man, and then it transitions back to him just like curmudgeonly dragging stools across the stage.
Yeah,
set up for like the king's entrance.
All of the beginning of Act 5. It's
God.
I love that piece.
McD moving
It's
stools.
a treat.
Right, and not in the script. Totally not in the script, but in the text that he's like struggling with
text,
this.
Yes.
The last thing I wanted to say about Foley art that's so important in Midsummer specifically is that when talking about the element of magic, for Elizabethans, as well as I think for many of us today, it's what happens invisibly, right? Magic is what happens in what we cannot see. And so sound is something that we cannot see. It's a phenomenon that we can only perceive with our ears, right? And so in a lot of ways, you're literally creating that magic by using something that is invisible to the human eye. I mean, yes, you can see the person performing it, but that's not the same thing. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
totally.
that's absolutely 100% legit. I mean, that was one of my favorite aspects of the Foley, is that it's its own indication of like a very fantastical magical process, because that's what music is to many degrees, and just that idea of expressing in a different way brings up the conversation happening in the show to that much more of a slightly surreal level, because the audience is receiving this information through the input of information that like through the input of stimuli that they're not used to like getting emotional information through. So like it, so like just the creatively weird noises that were, accompanying each of the fairies, like all of that kind of stuff that really was drawn from the work of the actors and also the work of the show overall in developing like the elements that these fairies were drawing from and like how those are expressed in a musical sense. Like all of that is just very fantastical to me to begin with, and so like seeing it as almost like a magic show of its own accord was a really cool thing.
Now, if you kind listeners would like to have an opportunity to see and hear all that we're talking about, I know that coming out soon, if you watch our Facebook, will be a recorded version of Midsummer, the version that played last season at
Music Haven.
Music
was the
Haven.
venue. It's a gorgeous recording that YTK Productions put together for us, and it's an awesome piece of archival footage from a season that was really near and dear to our hearts. So we're gonna be making it streamable on our website, so you'll be hearing from us about that.
Yeah, big shout out to Catherine Wright of
Yes.
YTK
Oh,
Works
man.
and Mona
Absolutely.
Golub of Music Haven.
Oh,
and
yeah.
her phenomenal crew. I mean, they helped us create belief in so many helpful ways.
What a great venue.
It was such a treat.
Yes.
Now, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we are almost out of time. We have enough time to go around the table one more for some quick thoughts before we'll have Shae lead us
Yes.
out.
Thank you so much for coming, Rags, and also, for joining in the conversation, Mike. I know that this production was one that meant a lot to me as an artist, because it delved into a lot of different forms of expression that I've often yearned to find ways to tie in to contemporary performance. So just getting to live with all of those elements and aspects at the same time was super artistically fulfilling. And this conversation, I feel, has been like a really solid reflection of kind of the process that we went through to discover all of these things and what was important to us. So, I hope everyone listening in, feels like they got a little bit of a teaser of kind of what goes on behind the scenes for us, and what a production process might look like, at least, what we talk about around the table, sometimes in the rehearsal room, and also sometimes, over drinks and food at a bar afterwards as well. But, this is the kind of stuff that inspires us, and we hope it can inspire everyone else out there as well to be curious about this important stuff.
Yeah, I mean, as you can tell, even this conversation was cooperative, just like our company is.
Yeah.
If you, if you want to see us perform something, please check out Midsummer. It was a very, very fun show to be in and to work with this great company doing. I'm sure Christoph and Mike would agree with me on that it's just truly, it was the perfect show to do last year. It was the right time to do the show. It means a lot to me to have been able to play that Peter Quinn's role for a second time.
Yeah. You're very good for it.
Doesn't help that I'm like that in real life.
No.
Typecasting.
So if you want to know who I am, listeners, that's me in real life. Just watch that and you'll know what I deal with
What
on a
he
daily
deals
basis. Organized chaos. It's okay. It's okay. Rude mechanical, that's me. It was great to be able to play that character again and really deepen my acting skills in the character itself, bringing things that I did the first time, changing things, creating new things. It was just great. It was fun. And I hope that these listeners, if there's any close to us, they do come and see us live and not just hear a podcast, because
it's the complete picture.
We're very good
is
live.
To come see us. No, to speak to that a little bit, more of the accolades and the love for Midsummer. Oberon and Theseus were a lot of fun to play. But speaking to kind of what we're discussing overall, yes, please come see our shows, watch and listen to the podcast. This is going to develop. This is going to change, just like everything else changes. Everything changes.
Yes,
but
we're kind of flying by the seat of our pants, but we wanted to throw something out there in the world.
That's right. Today we talked a lot about process and kind of artistic vision, and I know for a fact we're going to touch on the many aspects of our life in these. So please give a listen, and we promise to treat you to at least something to get you through these rough months. I think months is going to be appropriate timeline that we have ahead of us here in 2020 April. I don't know, you're gonna hear this on what, the 21st or the 20th. So yeah, stick with us, and thank you for listening.
Also, because it's gonna be airing next Wednesday. That's almost Shakespeare's birthday, so happy birthday, Willie.
Happy birthday, Shakespeare.
Rob.
Yep. I have to actually just extend a huge thank you to everyone that's here, taking all the time out of their day to make this podcast happen. A big thanks to the hosts, Shae and Phil. You're wonderful to work with. A huge thanks to our participating artists in the conversation, Rags and Mike. It was a wonder talking to you today about this fantastic piece.
Vicky, shout out to Vicky.
Rob,
Thank you, Vicky,
for doing all that
reading
you do.
Titania. That
Oh
was
yeah,
amazing.
Vic too. Let's clarify that she didn't play the role in.
Oh, I'm sorry. In the staged, the filmed recording. Yes, if you go looking for
in-
that, she's not the actress playing.
But she is the voice of Titania
Yes,
at the
yes.
beginning of this episode.
That's
Oh,
great
right,
to know.
Rags, I didn't know
I
you
had
knew
no
that.
idea. No, that's amazing. I cannot wait to go back and listen to that.
It's
this
dope.
is
It's dope.
wonderful. What you guys have put together. The Bardcast Weekly is going to be fantastic. I mean, it already has been for me tonight. And I certainly want to thank each and every one of you, as well as all of our listeners, for being here, and every member of the company, and all of the day players we've worked with. You guys make this possible in a very difficult time where we're pondering our isolation and we're, continually disconnected from each other and from our daily routine. Midsummer, in essence, is about that belief in magic and how it can affect and enhance your life. And I think I want to encourage all of our listeners to continue to remember that and to find their own moments of everyday magic as they survive COVID-19 here in 2020.
Oh man, Rags, and this is why we brought you on. Oh goodness.
It's a voice we needed to hear.
What a sage he is. So
right.
Tune in next week for all new conversation and content. You can also visit our website at www.willkempsplayers.com.
willkempsplayers.com.
Shoot us an email at weeklybardcast@gmail.com or follow us on Facebook and Instagram at willkempsplayers. So we'll be back soon, but for tonight, the elements be kind to thee and make thy spirits all of comfort. Fare thee well.